In the twilight of medieval Europe, the land was a tapestry of stone and shadow, of villages huddled against the wind and fields swept with mist. The grave was never simply a hole in the earth, nor a place where the body surrendered quietly to time. It was a threshold, a fragile, trembling boundary between the world of the living and a realm that refused to release its hold. Even in death, the body remained a vessel of uncertainty, a reminder that the familiar order of life could falter, and that the dead might still walk among the living, unseen yet ever present. The cemetery, if it could be called that, was more than a site for interment. It was a theater of anxiety. Villagers approached with wary reverence, glancing at pale shapes beneath fresh soil, wondering if the corpse beneath might stir in restless disquiet. Fear had a scent then. Damp earth, the faint copper of blood, the faint decay already beginning to seep from shallow graves. The dead were markers, both literal and psychological, signaling the limits of human understanding. One grave, unmarked or hastily filled, could ignite panic. One corpse improperly buried could become a story whispered by candlelight, growing with each telling into a tale that would haunt generations. This fear was rooted not only in superstition, but in experience. Medieval Europe was a land perpetually acquainted with death. Plague swept through villages, sparing no home. Famine left its own grim signatures. War and pestilence ensured that corpses were never far from the gaze of the living. In these centuries, death was not abstract. It was immediate, corporeal, and often grotesque in its suddenness. The sight of a body, pale and contorted beneath the shallow soil, was enough to awaken old anxieties. The dread that the dead might rise, that their presence could bring misfortune, disease, or spiritual corruption. Corpses became symbols. Symbols of mortality, yes, but also of something more elusive. They were reminders that life, no matter how vibrant, could be undone in an instant. Villagers and clergy alike believed that death was not a simple conclusion, but a process fraught with potential dangers. The proper handling of a body was more than ceremony. It was a ritual of survival. The dead were sometimes staked, salted, or laid with amulets. Some were buried at crossroads, others beneath thresholds, each practice a manifestation of a society grappling with the limits of its comprehension. Every ritual reflected the same fear, that the dead, if neglected, could return with intent, and that memory alone was insufficient to hold them in place. Yet fascination always walked alongside fear. The dead carried stories, histories, and even secrets. Monks recorded anomalies in burial, noting bodies that resisted decay or graves disturbed by unknown forces. Peasants murmured of visions in the night, of lights flickering over tombs, or of strange sounds emanating from churchyards. The corpse was both a terror and a repository of wonder, a paradox that bound the living to the departed in a complex web of reverence and anxiety. It was not merely death that unsettled humanity, but the refusal of death to remain confined, the suggestion that life might persist beyond its ordained boundary in ways that could not be fully understood. In the villages of France, Germany, and Italy, charnel grounds were carefully delineated, yet even the most sacred cemetery was never fully secure. Tales of corpses exhumed for inspection, bones counted, bodies examined, signs of decay scrutinized, were common enough to seep into folk memory. These acts, performed with solemnity and ritual precision, underscored a profound human desire to negotiate with death, to assert dominion over it even when it had triumphed. Every observation, every careful exhumation, was an attempt to impose order upon an inherently chaotic inevitability. The psychological weight of the corpse was magnified by a medieval understanding of the soul. The living believed that the dead lingered not only as flesh but as spirit. Improper burial might trap the soul in liminality, leaving it vulnerable to corruption or malevolence. Illness, misfortune, and unexplained phenomena were often attributed to these restless presences. The dead were thus at once absent and overpoweringly present, silent witnesses, spectral reminders of limits, guardians of lessons too grim to ignore. In this atmosphere, every grave became a threshold of contemplation. The living did not simply inter a body. They entered into dialogue with mortality itself. A burial was a negotiation, a plea, and an act of defiance rolled into one. Villagers placed crosses, sprinkled holy water, or carved symbols into coffins, each gesture an attempt to secure peace for the departed and protection for themselves. Even the act of looking upon the earth above a freshly filled grave was a study in tension, respect tempered with terror, devotion entwined with the suspicion that the dead were never truly still. And yet, there was a subtle poetry to this unease. In the careful tending of graves, in the ritualized rites that accompanied the dead, communities expressed a complex understanding of existence. They acknowledged the impermanence of life, the fragility of human endeavor, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. The corpse became a mirror in which the living saw both their fears and their aspirations, the hope that remembrance could confer dignity, the fear that neglect might summon calamity, and the quiet recognition that death, for all its certainty, could still elude comprehension. By the flickering light of torches and the slow passage of seasons, cemeteries became landscapes of memory and dread. They were spaces where the living measured themselves against the inevitability of decay, and where the dead, for all their silence, continued to shape the rhythms of human life. One grave might hold a farmer, another a child, yet each resonated with the same significance. A reminder that the dead were never fully absent, that history itself could be felt beneath the soil, and that the human imagination was both terrified and enthralled by what it could not fully control. In the uneasy grave, life and death brushed against one another with a delicate insistence. The body, inert and cold, was not merely matter. It was a symbol, a warning, a memory made tangible. And in this liminal space, where fear met reverence, medieval Europe confronted one of its most enduring truths: that the dead, though buried, were never truly gone. They lingered in shadow, in story, in ritual, and through them, humanity glimpsed both its fragility and its enduring need to make sense of the inevitable. As the wind moved across the fields, carrying the faintest scent of earth and decay, the grave remained uneasy. The living withdrew, but the dead lingered, silent yet profound. And in that quiet presence, one could feel the echo of centuries. A reminder that to live is to remember, and to remember is to walk forever in the shadow of the dead. Long before vampires prowled the imagination of storytellers, fear itself had a body. In medieval Europe, the dead were not inert. They were shadows cast over village streets, figures glimpsed from the corner of the eye, presences that moved where they should not. The restless dead were more than legend. They were perceived as real, immediate threats, and communities lived with the constant knowledge that death did not always respect its boundaries. Stories of the walking dead were whispered by candlelight, carried in hushed tones from hearth to hearth. A corpse seen in the moonlight, a light flickering over a grave, or a fresh mound turned by unknown hands could ignite panic. These were not tales meant to entertain, but warnings, codified in fear and reinforced by experience. Illness, famine, and sudden death were often attributed to spirits or corpses that refused rest. The living came to understand that the dead were agents, their influence subtle yet relentless, capable of shaping the fortunes of entire communities. This terror was deeply entwined with ritual and law. Villagers and clergy alike believed that the restless dead could bring misfortune, disease, or spiritual corruption. Bodies were staked, buried at crossroads, or decapitated, practices meant to anchor the soul and ensure it would not roam. Every act, no matter how gruesome, was an attempt to impose order on the unpredictable, to protect the living from forces they could not name or fully comprehend. The dead were at once vulnerable and powerful, inert yet capable of agency in the minds of those who feared them. Fear of the walking dead also reflected a profound human need to explain the inexplicable. In a time before medicine and science could offer clarity, death itself became a story. Villages created a taxonomy of the dead: the corpse that returned from disease, the revenant that sought vengeance, the restless soul that haunted dreams. Each classification was an attempt to understand, to categorize the unknowable. It was a dialogue between reason and superstition, fact and imagination, mortality and memory. Yet these beliefs were never purely irrational. Plague, famine, and violence had left their mark on the landscape and on the bodies themselves. Decomposition, swelling, and discoloration could appear uncanny or violent, and in an age without modern knowledge, Such appearances were read as signs of life beyond death. The living interpreted these transformations as warnings, messages, or threats, evidence that some graves could not contain what lay within. Fear was thus rooted in observation as much as in imagination, a rational dread heightened by circumstance. The dead became actors on a stage of communal anxiety. Exhumations, inspections, and ritual burnings were performed in public, often with entire villages in attendance. The corpse, once a private sorrow, became a spectacle of moral and spiritual authority. Townsfolk watched as their fears were confronted, measured, and ritually contained. The acts themselves were theater, but the emotion behind them was very real. Awe, horror, reverence, and the relentless need to assert control over what could not be mastered. In this way, the dead walked not only in stories, but in the minds and hearts of the living. They haunted dreams, shaped decisions, and demanded attention through absence as much as presence. To witness a grave disturbed or a corpse misaligned was to feel the pull of history itself, a reminder that death is not a single moment, but a process that shapes the living long after the body has ceased to breathe. And so, fear became ritualized, codified, and passed down through generations. The dead walked, not merely as flesh animated, but as memory, as warning, as a constant negotiation between mortality and survival. In the stillness of the night, when shadows flickered over stone and soil, the villagers knew. The boundary between life and death was never fixed, and in that uncertainty, humanity discovered its enduring need to respect, fear, and remember. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, death demanded more than grief. It demanded negotiation. The corpse was not a silent object to be buried and forgotten, but a presence whose proper care could shape the fate of the living. Rituals arose, intricate and solemn, meant to bind the restless, honor the departed, and protect the fragile communities from the unseen. Each practice was a dialogue with mortality, a way for humankind to impose order on a force that would not yield. Graves were marked with symbols, crosses etched into wood or stone, the body carefully arranged to prevent any return from beyond. In some regions, corpses were staked through the heart, limbs pinned, or bodies buried at crossroads, measures that spoke to a profound fear that the dead might rise with purpose. Salt was sprinkled, candles lit, prayers intoned, as though each act could persuade the body to remain obedient to its burial. To neglect these rites was to invite misfortune, to challenge the fragile boundary between life and death. This was not merely superstition, but a practical response to observation. Bodies did not always decay as expected. Swelling, discoloration, or unexpected motion could appear frighteningly alive to the medieval eye. These anomalies were interpreted as signs that the dead could influence the living, carry vengeance, or return as harbingers of plague and famine. Rituals of the corpse were thus attempts to translate uncertainty into control, to give shape to a force otherwise incomprehensible. Communities developed complex ceremonies around death. The dying were often prepared with prayers and protective charms, ensuring that their transition would not linger. Funerals were not simple processions but acts of negotiation with the unknown. The corpse was attended to with the same vigilance given to a living family member, for even in repose, it demanded recognition. Villagers believed that neglect or error could leave a body restless, a spirit roaming freely to disturb the world of the living. The rituals extended beyond practical protection. They were moral and psychological frameworks. In staking, burning, or carefully reburying the dead, communities enacted narratives of virtue, sin, and cosmic order. They acknowledged the impermanence of life while reinforcing the hierarchy of the living and the dead. Every careful gesture, every ceremonial precaution, expressed both fear and respect, a recognition that the body was a vessel of history, memory, and consequence. Yet there was also a subtle poetry in these rites. They were acts of care as much as acts of protection. Families wept over the grave. Villagers participated in ceremonies that bound them together through shared reverence, and prayers echoed over the soil, a rhythm connecting the living and the dead. These rituals transformed grief into structure, terror into meaning. The corpse was not merely a threat, it became a medium through which life could be measured, remembered, and honored. In some regions, the rituals became spectacles. Exhumations, inspections, and ceremonial burnings were public acts, designed to assert authority, teach vigilance, and reinforce communal memory. The corpse, once a private sorrow, was transformed into a moral and spiritual guide. Townsfolk watched as fear was confronted and disciplined, as ritual imposed order on chaos, and as stories of the unquiet dead were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Through these rituals, the dead were given a place, yet their presence remained undeniable. They shaped law, custom, and the rhythms of human existence. Each burial, each prayer, each ritual act was a negotiation with history itself, a way of acknowledging that death could not simply be ignored, and that the living could only coexist with it through reverence, vigilance, and imagination. And so, the rituals of the corpse became a quiet testament to human ingenuity and fear, a bridge between worlds, a language of mortality written in earth, salt, and flame. In the stillness of the graveyard, among shadows of stone and soil, the dead rested, yet their influence lingered, a reminder that to live fully was to honor what could never truly be left behind. In the trembling towns and villages of medieval Europe, death no longer moved quietly. It came in overwhelming waves. The plague did not wait. It swept through homes, markets, and monasteries alike, leaving the living to confront a reality in which corpses were both abundant and unknowable. Graves were dug in fevered haste, sometimes too shallow, sometimes too crowded, and the very act of burial became a source of terror. The dead were no longer isolated anomalies. They were a mass, a tide of bodies that pressed upon the senses and the imagination. The Black Death, as it would be called centuries later, brought the presence of death into every corner of life. Villagers reported strange phenomena: lights flickering over plague cemeteries, cries heard in the wind, shadows moving where no one should tread. Rumors spread of corpses rising from shallow graves, of families struck down by unseen forces. Fear, already woven into European ritual and superstition, intensified to a fevered pitch. Death became a force not merely observed, but feared in its immediacy and relentlessness. Communities responded as they had for generations, but on an unprecedented scale. Bodies were salted, staked, or ritually burned to prevent the return of the unquiet. Churches consecrated new ground for mass burials, often fenced and guarded, as though the earth itself required protection from the relentless accumulation of death. Clergy, overwhelmed by necessity, adapted old rites, emphasizing the containment of spirit as much as the care of flesh. Each act was a desperate assertion that order could still exist in a world overrun by chaos. Yet the rituals were as much psychological as practical. Villagers clung to patterns and ceremonies, for in these gestures lay the semblance of control. Each grave, each prayer was a barrier against panic. Death had become visible, immediate, and incomprehensible in its magnitude, and the living needed structure to withstand its weight. Salted graves, prayers, and holy symbols were tools of defense, a language through which humanity could speak to forces it could not comprehend. The plague also exposed the unsettling reality of decay. Corpses decomposed rapidly in mass graves, their forms sometimes grotesque, sometimes strangely preserved by cold or soil. What the living saw became a canvas for fear and imagination. Disease was interpreted as an extension of the dead's will, a warning from beyond the grave. One corpse improperly buried could haunt not only the dreams of a family but the health of the entire village. In the eyes of the terrified, the plague was a dialogue with the dead, a reminder that mortality was never entirely natural, never entirely predictable. Amid the terror, fascination persisted. People watched, recorded, and remarked upon the effects of the plague, documenting anomalies in decomposition, strange marks on the skin, or bodies that resisted decay. Chroniclers described the dead as both victim and agent, an intersection of biology and myth, reminding future generations that human imagination often meets fact in the shadow of catastrophe. Every observation, every whispered account, shaped the folklore of the dead, blending experience with interpretation, fear with awe. In this environment, panic was as contagious as disease. Entire villages reorganized around the rhythms of death. Work ceased, markets emptied, and daily life bent to the presence of corpses. Yet through ritual and remembrance, the living sought to assert some measure of authority, to claim that death could be acknowledged, documented, and in some sense restrained. Even in the most harrowing months, faith and superstition provided a structure to confront what was otherwise incomprehensible. And so, plague and panic became intertwined, a testament to humanity's dual response to mortality: horror and adaptation, terror and ritual. In mass graves and quiet cemeteries alike, the living learned that death could not simply be ignored. It demanded recognition, negotiation, and constant vigilance. In the shadow of the pestilence, the dead walked not just in story, but in memory, shaping human consciousness in ways that would endure long after the last fever had broken. In medieval Europe, the line between veneration and fear was fragile, often as thin as a candle's flame in a darkened chapel. Some corpses refused to decay, their bodies preserved in ways that seemed miraculous, their presence invoking awe among the living. To one community, such preservation signaled sanctity, divine favor, or a miracle to inspire devotion. To another, it was a warning, a sign that the dead might resist the natural order, lingering in ways that unsettled hearts and minds alike. The preserved corpse became a canvas for human interpretation. Saints' bodies, carefully embalmed or naturally incorruptible, were enshrined, displayed, and revered. Pilgrims traveled great distances to witness them, seeking intercession, miracles, or guidance from the threshold between life and death. Yet this reverence was shadowed by a deeper recognition. The same preservation that inspired devotion could equally inspire terror. If the dead could linger in one village as a saint, why might another rise as something darker, something untamed by faith or ritual? Monks, chroniclers, and clerics recorded these anomalies with precision, yet their accounts often reflected the tension between reason and wonder. They documented swelling, discoloration, and other signs of what we now understand as natural processes of decay, or the miraculous influence of climate, soil, or disease. But to the medieval mind, such phenomena were never neutral. They were signs, messages, and sometimes warnings. The corpse spoke, whether to guide, chastise, or terrify. The same cultural imagination that revered incorrupt saints also gave rise to legends of revenants and restless spirits. Tales of the unquiet dead spread through villages with hushed fascination. A body that should have returned to dust instead remained, a figure in shadow or in whispered rumor. Fear and awe became intertwined, for the line between a holy presence and a malevolent one was determined less by reality than by the fragile lens of perception. Communities understood instinctively that the dead could influence life long after burial, and that even miraculous bodies carried the weight of agency, silent yet potent. In some regions, extraordinary care was taken to distinguish saint from monster. Relics were examined, bones enshrined in reliquaries, and miracles catalogued with meticulous devotion. Elsewhere, the restless were restrained, bodies staked, heads removed, graves salted, to prevent perceived corruption or spiritual contamination. Every practice reflected a society negotiating with the unknown, attempting to preserve balance between reverence and survival. The dead were never merely objects. They were interlocutors, mediators of fear and hope alike. The psychological resonance of these bodies cannot be understated. For the living, the corpse was a mirror of their deepest anxieties. The fragility of life, the inevitability of decay, the possibility that mortality might extend beyond its intended boundary. Saints offered reassurance, examples of divine order amidst chaos. Monsters reminded humanity that the natural order was never guaranteed, that the dead could assert themselves when human vigilance faltered. Faith and fear, devotion and dread, existed in delicate equilibrium, each reinforcing the other. Even in quiet contemplation, the preserved corpse held a lesson for the living. To encounter such a body was to confront time itself, the impermanence of flesh, the endurance of memory, and the enduring human desire to make sense of death. Whether saint or monster, the corpse served as a bridge between worlds, a threshold that invited reflection, ritual, and awe. And so, the dead continued to shape medieval consciousness, their bodies commanding attention long after the breath of life had faded. In their stillness, they demanded interpretation, care, and respect. In their preservation, whether miraculous or feared, they revealed the dual nature of human belief, the yearning for the divine, and the instinctive dread of what refuses to remain silent. The corpse, eternal in its quiet power, was never simply gone. It lingered in shadow, in story, and in the imagination of a people bound to the fragile, unsteady line between life and death. In the shadowed villages and forested valleys of medieval Europe, fear often took form in wood, iron, and fire. The dead were not always silent, and the living learned, through whispered stories and harsh necessity, that a corpse could defy rest. Tales of the walking dead, revenants who wandered at night, draining life or spreading disease, shaped ritual and law alike. To confront them, communities developed practices both grim and precise. Stakes driven through hearts, heads severed, bodies burned. These acts were more than violence. They were negotiation with mortality, an attempt to command what could not otherwise be tamed. The vampire, as legend would immortalize, was born from these fears. It was rarely depicted as a monstrous creature of imagination alone. It was first a reflection of human anxiety, a manifestation of the dead's refusal to remain inert. Villagers observed corpses that appeared swollen, discolored, or strangely preserved. In the absence of scientific understanding, such bodies were read as signs of danger, evidence that death was not yet complete, that life could persist beyond expectation in grotesque or threatening forms. Every stake, every flame, was an act of precaution, performed to restore balance and protect the living from what might emerge from the grave. Fear was codified in law and custom. Municipal authorities in parts of Eastern and Central Europe issued ordinances governing post-mortem treatment. Exhumations were ordered for inspection, rituals of restraint prescribed, and extreme measures, staking, decapitation, and burning, were sanctioned in cases where the dead were deemed restless. These practices were communal, public, and deliberate. They transformed the corpse from a private sorrow into a visible emblem of human concern, a cautionary figure whose management demanded both courage and ritual precision. Yet the acts were as symbolic as they were practical. To stake or burn a corpse was to assert dominion over death itself. It was a statement that mortality, though inevitable, could be understood, contained, and negotiated. Villagers and clergy alike recognized that terror needed form, and that ritual, whether in the sharp point of a stake, the crackling flames of a pyre, or the arrangement of bones, could give shape to the ineffable. Fear, in these moments, became a tool, a method for confronting chaos and preserving communal equilibrium. The psychological weight of the unquiet dead extended beyond individual encounters. Stories circulated of corpses exhumed weeks, months, or years after burial, discovered walking in their shrouds, or bearing signs of supernatural activity. Such reports were often accompanied by rituals of purification. Holy water, prayers, and sacred implements were applied to ensure that what had been disturbed, or what had never truly rested, would not threaten again. In this interplay between observation, ritual, and imagination, the vampire and the revenant were less myth and more lived experience, encoded into the social and spiritual fabric of Europe. Fear, fascination, and reverence intertwined. The living stood vigil over graves, ensuring that the dead remained obedient, while simultaneously weaving their deeds into story, legend, and law. The corpse became a medium through which communities expressed moral order, religious devotion, and survival instinct. In staking and burning, Europe confronted mortality in its most physical and urgent form, translating terror into action and uncertainty into structure. And yet, even in the destruction of the body, the dead exerted influence. Memory lingered. The tales of restless corpses persisted in whispers, in folklore, and in ritual. Each act of staking or burning was both a resolution and a reminder. Death, though inevitable, was never absolute, and the living must remain vigilant, attentive to what walked unseen. The corpse, in its resistance and in its silence, shaped society, morality, and imagination, teaching that fear is not merely a feeling, but a guide, a force as real and consequential as life itself. In the quiet chambers of medieval monasteries and early universities, the dead assumed a new, unsettling role. No longer merely vessels of superstition or dread, corpses became subjects of observation, of study, and, for some, fascination bordering on obsession. The human body, once cloaked in mystery and ritual, was slowly revealed beneath the scalpel. Flesh, bone, and organ yielded their secrets to those willing to confront mortality directly, and to do so with a mixture of awe and horror. Dissection tables were spaces both sacred and profane. Light fell in shafts through narrow windows, illuminating the pale contours of skin and the intricate geometry of bone. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, and the muted whispers of students and assistants blended with the quiet rhythm of cutting and probing. Each incision was a dialogue with death itself, a measured attempt to comprehend what life had made inevitable: decay, fragility, and the hidden machinery of existence. Here the corpse was no longer merely feared. It was studied, catalogued, and in its stillness, revealed truths that could never be gleaned in life. Yet the act of dissection was never free of fear. Even as early anatomists sought knowledge, they confronted the deep-seated anxieties of a society where death was potent and ever-present. Bodies were often exhumed for this purpose, their previous graves violated, their repose disturbed. Villagers whispered of desecration. Clergy condemned the act as sacrilege. The corpse, once a silent witness, was now an active participant in a psychological drama that stretched across generations. The tension between curiosity and reverence, science and superstition. Observation revealed both beauty and terror. Tendons and vessels, organs and sinew, were intricate in their design, yet grotesque in their finality. Decomposition, swelling, and discoloration were natural, but to medieval eyes, they suggested life lingering beyond death, or a spirit's defiance of natural law. Every body told a story, not only of the individual it had been, but of the fragile, intricate systems that underpinned human life. To study it was to confront mortality in its rawest form, to engage with the inevitability that bound all human existence. This exploration extended beyond mere anatomy. It was a psychological confrontation, a way for humanity to wrestle with the fears it could not banish. The corpse became both a teacher and a warning, a testament to the fragility of flesh and the inexorability of time. Each cadaver on the table, each bone measured, was a mirror reflecting the anxieties of a culture steeped in plague, superstition, and reverence. Knowledge was intertwined with dread, and the act of observation was inseparable from the recognition of mortality itself. The rituals of science, dissection, cataloguing, and illustration, paralleled older forms of ritual. As in staking, burning, or consecrating graves, the living sought to impose order on chaos, to understand the boundaries of life and death. But in this case, knowledge became the medium. Anatomy offered a language through which fear could be articulated, curiosity satisfied, and mortality confronted with reason rather than ritual. The body, silent and immovable, guided the living into reflection, awe, and a tempered dread that acknowledged the limits of comprehension. Even in these early laboratories, the influence of the corpse extended beyond the walls. Students carried stories of the dead into towns, classrooms, and homes. Folklore and scientific observation merged, producing legends, warnings, and reflections that shaped culture for centuries. The corpse taught that death was not an absence, but a presence, a teacher, a mirror, and at times a silent admonition. In the stillness of these chambers, illuminated by candle and filtered light, humanity confronted the paradox of mortality, that the dead, though motionless, could instruct the living in ways both profound and terrifying. Each body studied, each organ revealed, was a reminder that knowledge and fear are inseparable, and that the corpse, though stripped of life, remains an enduring bridge between existence and the unknowable beyond. In the villages and towns of medieval Europe, the dead were never fully private. Graves were spaces of performance, where the fears, anxieties, and rituals of the living were enacted for communal observation. The grave became a stage, and the corpse, whether recently interred or long forgotten, was the silent actor commanding attention. Every exhumation, inspection, and ritualized disturbance of a body was both spectacle and cautionary tale, a drama performed for those who lived under the ever-present shadow of death. Mass graves and individual tombs alike drew the gaze of communities. Clergy and officials often presided over public inspections, ensuring that burial practices had been properly observed. Bodies were examined for signs of decay, deformity, or resistance to death's usual processes. A swollen corpse, a displaced limb, a grave disturbed by soil or root was read as a portent, a message from the realm beyond life. Villagers gathered to witness, to learn, and to bear collective responsibility. Fear, once private and silent, was transformed into a shared experience, ritualized and observed. The theatricality of these practices was deliberate. Stakes were driven through hearts, graves were salted, and bones were arranged to demonstrate vigilance. These acts, though practical, also served as instruction. Each movement, each gesture, communicated a moral and spiritual order to the spectators. The grave was a classroom and the corpse a teacher. In this theater of mortality, the living learned how to respect, fear, and contain what could not be fully controlled. The performance was as much about reassurance as it was about discipline, the living asserting authority over death, while acknowledging its inescapable presence. Public exhumations also served as communal memory. Villagers would recount the circumstances of each death, the illnesses, the accidents, and the stories of those who had passed. In this way, the grave became a repository not only of flesh, but of history, of shared grief and superstition. The presence of the dead, even in inspection or reburial, reinforced the bonds of society, shaping collective understanding of mortality and morality alike. Every corpse was a reflection of life lived, a cautionary example, and a symbol of the fragile boundary between the living and the departed. Even the act of observation carried psychological weight. Witnessing the body laid bare, the flesh cold and silent, reminded the living of their own fragility. Each exhumation was a confrontation with mortality, a lesson in the impermanence of flesh, and the inevitability of decay. In this way, the theatrical nature of the grave served both practical and existential purposes. Communities performed ritual, codified fear, and asserted moral order, while simultaneously confronting the profound truth that life is fleeting and death is persistent. The spectacle also bridged the gap between superstition and authority. Clergy and magistrates orchestrated these public rituals, blending religious observance with social control. The corpse was both sacred and didactic. By transforming death into a visible and structured act, communities found a measure of reassurance that even in fear, even in horror, the boundaries of life and death could be acknowledged, understood, and to some extent managed. In the quiet aftermath, when the crowds dispersed and the graveyard returned to silence, the presence of the corpse lingered. Shadows over earth and stone reminded the living that the dead, though motionless, continued to shape thought, action, and belief. The grave, performed upon and observed, was a theater of mortality, a place where the living measured themselves against the inevitability of decay, and where the dead, in their silence, maintained an enduring, profound influence over the human imagination. In medieval Europe, fear of the dead was never purely personal. It was communal, codified, and often enforced by law. Corpses, once interred, were not simply left to the earth. Their treatment was dictated by statutes, ordinances, and church decrees, reflecting a society intent on controlling the unpredictable power of death. The law became a tool to manage both the physical body and the psychological unease it inspired, ensuring that the restless dead could not threaten the living, or the social order itself. Municipal codes and ecclesiastical regulations outlined the proper methods of burial, the timing of funerals, and even the handling of bodies after exhumation. Certain anomalies, corpses that resisted decay, graves disturbed by unknown forces, or bodies suspected of vampiric activity, required formal inspection and ritual intervention sanctioned by authorities. These laws were precise, often severe, and enforced with the weight of both civil and spiritual consequences. To violate them was to invite misfortune, for the restless dead were believed capable of retribution if ignored or mishandled. The presence of these laws highlights a profound medieval understanding. Death was not merely an event, but a process intertwined with morality, faith, and communal stability. Corpses were recognized as agents, their condition and treatment reflecting the care, or negligence, of the living. A grave improperly dug, a body left unattended, or a burial conducted without ceremony could provoke suspicion, ritualized intervention, or legal action. In codifying fear, the authorities translated intangible anxieties into structure, and terror into enforceable practice. Legal oversight extended to exhumations, inspections, and in some cases punitive measures. Clergy, magistrates, and even village elders oversaw the verification of death, the handling of suspicious corpses, and the application of protective rituals. Bodies were staked, burned, or consecrated in accordance with law and tradition, and public attention often accompanied these acts. The corpse, once private and mourned in solitude, became a matter of civic responsibility, a tangible expression of collective vigilance over the boundary between life and death. These regulations were not arbitrary. They arose from centuries of observation, superstition, and the harsh lessons of plague, famine, and conflict. Communities had learned that the dead, if neglected or misunderstood, could influence life long after burial. Disease, misfortune, and unexplained phenomena were attributed to corpses improperly handled. Law, then, was as much a practical precaution as a moral imperative, a framework through which society could manage fear, maintain ritual order, and protect the living from forces beyond comprehension. At the same time, legal codification gave a performative dimension to death. Exhumations conducted under official sanction were communal events, bringing together villagers as witnesses to the care or correction of the corpse. The law transformed grief into ritualized observation, terror into structure, and superstition into enforceable practice. The corpse became both object and symbol, evidence of mortality, reminder of duty, and agent of moral authority. Even the most meticulous statutes could not fully contain human imagination. Tales of revenants, restless saints, and unquiet spirits persisted despite regulation. Legal bones codified procedure, but they also preserved narrative. Each decree, each ordinance, was a testament to a society striving to order the chaos of mortality, to reconcile awe, fear, and devotion, and to assert mastery over what remained, ultimately unknowable. In this way, law and corpse converged, forming a dialogue across generations. The living wrote rules for the dead, yet the dead, in turn, continued to shape thought, behavior, and belief. Every grave, every regulation, was a negotiation with mortality itself, a recognition that the boundary between life and death could never be absolute. Even centuries later, the echoes of these laws linger, a reminder that human fear, codified in statute, is itself a mirror of mortality, reverence, and the enduring presence of what once walked among us. In the quiet of night, when hearths dimmed and shadows pooled across stone floors, the dead continued their subtle dominion over the living. Sleep was never entirely safe, for the restless dead were thought to move beyond graves, reaching into dreams, whispering warnings, or replaying unfinished lives. In medieval Europe, dreams of the deceased were both feared and revered, glimpses of a boundary between worlds where mortality had not fully claimed its prize. Villagers recounted visions of ancestors or neighbors, appearing with uncanny clarity, their presence accompanied by a chill or a scent of earth. Sometimes the dead delivered warnings, of sickness, of impending death, or of misfortune within the household. Other times they were silent observers, reminders of unfinished obligations, debts, or sins. These nocturnal encounters were interpreted as messages, and the faithful learned to treat them with caution, prayer, or ritual, an acknowledgement that sleep, like life, was inseparable from the influence of the departed. Dreams of the dead were also reflective of communal anxiety. Plague, famine, and war had rendered life precarious, and the mind, attuned to loss and mortality, gave form to fear through dreams. To witness a deceased figure was to confront the fragility of existence, to measure one's own impermanence against the enduring memory of those gone before. Sleep became a mirror, and the dead, whether corporeal or spectral, became teachers of vigilance, morality, and reflection. Clerics and mystics recorded these visions meticulously, providing guidance for interpretation. Dreams of the deceased were often categorized. Some were warnings of spiritual imbalance, others reminders of moral duty. Certain apparitions were thought to be saintly, guiding the living toward piety. Others were restless, requiring ritual or prayer to appease them. The boundary between divine and malevolent presence was thin, a shifting line discerned only through careful observation, faith, and reflection. The psychology of these dreams was complex. For the living, the deceased existed simultaneously as memory and agent, occupying a liminal space where emotion, imagination, and belief intertwined. To dream of a corpse was not merely to recall a face, but to encounter mortality itself, a presence that could be admonishing, consoling, or terrifying. These visions became a canvas upon which communities projected their collective fears, hopes, and obligations, reminding them that death was a dialogue, not an endpoint. Ritual often followed the dream. Incense, prayer, and offerings were made to ensure that the deceased found peace and that the living were protected from lingering influence. Houses were purified, graves blessed, and candles kept burning, as though light could guide the dead back to their place beneath the soil. Through these practices, communities negotiated with mortality, translating the ephemeral world of dreams into tangible action. The dead, though absent in body, shaped behavior, belief, and culture. Even the simplest dream carried profound weight. The dead existed as markers of morality, memory, and mortality, their presence extending beyond earth and stone into the intimate and fragile space of the mind. They reminded the living of obligations owed, of sins unatoned, and of love unexpressed. Dreams were both warning and consolation, an intimate reflection of the enduring connection between life and death. And so, in the hush of night, as wind whispered through eaves and shadows crept across floors, the dead walked once more, not in flesh but in thought, in vision, in the delicate and haunting theater of dreams. Sleep, like the grave, became a stage upon which humanity confronted mortality, negotiated with memory, and discovered that the presence of the deceased, though invisible, could never be fully ignored. In the villages and hamlets of medieval Europe, the dead were never truly gone. Their influence lingered in the flicker of a candle, the rustle of leaves, or the whisper of the wind through the graveyard. Fear of the unquiet dead became a thread woven through daily life, expressed in ritual, charm, and superstition. Communities devised countless methods to protect themselves, small gestures and elaborate ceremonies alike, each a testament to the enduring presence of the corpse in human imagination. Salt, iron, and herbs became talismans against the restless. Crosses were placed upon graves, stakes driven through suspected revenants, and fire was employed to purify. Even the simplest household object could carry significance. A knife laid under a pillow, a circle of salt at the doorway, a charm hanging above a bed. Every act was rooted in a logic that was at once practical and symbolic. It was a language of protection, a way for the living to assert control over forces they could neither see nor fully understand. Folklore amplified these precautions. Stories of wandering corpses, spirits returning to settle scores, or bodies rising to feed on the living were circulated widely, codifying communal fear. Children learned to respect boundaries and graves. Adults observed rituals meticulously, understanding that negligence could invite misfortune. The dead, in these narratives, became teachers, their power manifest not through violence alone, but through memory, suggestion, and the weight of cultural expectation. The superstitions surrounding death were often regional, reflecting local experience and belief. In one village, a headless corpse might be staked at a crossroads. In another, a corpse might be reburied beneath the threshold to guard against misfortune. Herbs such as rosemary, rue, or vervain were sprinkled over graves or carried on the person, believed to ward off influence from spirits lingering too long in the living world. Even the placement of graves followed pattern and purpose, a subtle choreography designed to maintain cosmic and social order. These practices were not merely attempts to frighten, they were deeply psychological, rooted in the understanding that the dead, whether corporeal or imagined, could shape the living. By ritualizing fear, communities transformed dread into action. The corpse became an intermediary between the tangible and the spiritual, a presence that demanded respect, negotiation, and attention. Each superstition encoded a moral lesson, a historical memory, and a measure of control over the uncertainties of mortality. Even in moments of calm, shadows carried significance. A chill in the air, an unusual sound in the night, or a disturbed grave could provoke the same meticulous attention as the most extreme preventative measures. Fear was rarely irrational. It was an adaptive response to centuries of experience, observation, and cultural transmission. Through superstition, humanity created a framework to understand mortality, to manage grief, and to protect itself from the lingering influence of what had once been flesh and breath. The dead shaped not only practice but imagination. Folk songs, tales, and religious narratives reflected their persistent presence, encoding cautionary advice and communal memory. In every ritual, talisman, or whispered story, the living recognized a truth. Death is never absolute, and the influence of those who have passed can extend far beyond the grave. These shadows, intangible yet powerful, reminded humanity of its fragility, its obligations, and its enduring fascination with the boundary between life and death. And so, superstition and shadow intertwined, forming a landscape in which fear became guidance, ritual became protection, and the corpse remained an ever-present participant in the life of the living. The dead, though silent and unmoving, continued to shape behavior, belief, and imagination, a reminder that even in absence, mortality commands vigilance, reverence, and profound reflection. After centuries of fear, superstition, and ritualized vigilance, medieval Europe slowly sought to contain the dead in ways both spiritual and physical. Graves became sacred spaces, consecrated and watched over, while cemeteries were organized, walled, and hallowed. The chaos of mass death, plague, and restless corpses gradually gave way to structures meant to enforce a fragile peace between life and death. Yet even in these quiet grounds, the memory of unrest lingered, an echo of past fear that shaped every act of burial, every prayer, and every stone laid upon soil. The consecrated grave represented more than containment. It was a testament to faith, a safeguard of both the living and the dead. Church authorities oversaw the placement of bodies, the proper rites of interment, and the care of graves, ensuring that the departed would rest undisturbed. Stake, salt, and fire gave way, in many places, to prayers, blessings, and ritual observances that relied on the sanctity of the soil and the authority of faith. Mortality was acknowledged, ritualized, and finally codified, transforming fear into solemn respect. This order extended beyond religious ritual to practical observation. Cemeteries were structured, bodies arranged in rows, graves marked and recorded. Communities monitored the spaces of death, preserving knowledge of who lay where and under what circumstances. Even as fear persisted in folklore and memory, the physical organization of the dead created a framework in which life could continue without constant threat from the restless or unknown. The grave, once a theater of fear, became a space of reflection, remembrance, and social stability. Yet silence was never absolute. Stories persisted of the unquiet dead, of spirits lingering at thresholds, and of corpses disturbed by natural forces. Villagers continued to perform small rituals at gravesides, sprinkling earth, lighting candles, offering prayers, acknowledging that the boundary between life and death remained delicate. In these practices, humanity demonstrated both humility and control, asserting that while death could be managed, it could never be ignored. Respect, vigilance, and ritual coexisted with the quietude of consecrated earth. Psychologically, the establishment of sacred cemeteries transformed fear into reflection. Families could mourn without the constant anxiety of unrest. Communities could honor the dead without succumbing to terror. The dead, contained and observed, became both moral guide and historical memory, a reminder of lineage, mortality, and the fragility of human existence. The rituals of burial, long intertwined with superstition and law, now served to sanctify rather than to restrain. Silence in this sense was not merely absence. It was order, understanding, and the acknowledgement of mortality's inevitability. The graveyard became a place of communion as well as containment. Pilgrims, worshippers, and mourners walked among the resting, reflecting on life and the enduring presence of memory. Stones marked names, dates, and deeds. Prayers and rituals ensured that the dead, though silent, continued to shape the living. The corpse, at last, found its place, its agency mediated through faith and ceremony, its influence felt through the living who honored, remembered, and learned from it. And so silence finally descended. But it was a quiet shaped by centuries of vigilance, ritual, and human imagination. Death was not vanquished, nor was fear eradicated. It was transformed. The restless were laid to rest, the living learned to negotiate the boundary between worlds, and the grave became a space in which mortality was contained, codified, and, at least for a time, rendered comprehensible. In this careful stillness, humanity glimpsed a fragile order, a temporary truce with the eternal, and a reminder that the presence of the dead, even in silence, continues to speak across time. Even centuries later, the restless dead of medieval Europe continue to haunt our collective memory. They live not in flesh or bone, but in story, ritual, and imagination, shaping the way humans perceive mortality, morality, and the unknown. The stakes, the salt, the prayers whispered over graves, these were not merely acts of superstition or fear. They were a negotiation with the inevitability of death, a testament to humanity's desire to understand, contain, and respect what could not be fully controlled. Legends of vampires, revenants, and incorruptible saints emerged from these centuries of vigilance. Tales circulated across villages, towns, and regions, blending observation, fear, and interpretation into folklore that would endure for generations. The body, long a site of dread and fascination, became a medium through which morality, memory, and caution were transmitted. Each story of a restless corpse warned of neglect, hubris, or sin, while also reinforcing communal norms and faith. In this way, the dead continued to educate the living, their influence extending far beyond the grave. The rituals of the past, staking, burning, blessing, exhuming, left their imprint on culture. Art, literature, and theater drew upon these practices, transforming fear into narrative, terror into symbolism. From the earliest chronicles of revenants to Gothic tales centuries later, the restless dead became enduring figures in human imagination. They reminded each generation that mortality is inescapable, that bodies and souls are intertwined with memory, and that the line between the living and the dead is never absolute. Even the establishment of sacred cemeteries, the codification of law, and the organization of burial grounds carried echoes of prior fear. The desire to structure death, both physically and ritually, originated in centuries when the dead could not be ignored. Every churchyard, every consecrated plot of land, stands as a testament to the ongoing negotiation between fear and reverence, between mortality and memory. Human civilization learned, slowly and painfully, that death could be managed, but never fully tamed. Psychologically, the legacy of the restless informs how humans engage with the unknown. We still fear what we cannot see, still create rituals to mark transitions, and still tell stories to explain the inexplicable. The medieval corpse, once feared for its potential to walk among the living, now inhabits our literature, folklore, and imagination. Its lesson is enduring. Respect mortality, acknowledge fear, and understand that life is measured not only by living, but by the memory of those who have gone before. These legacies are both cultural and moral. Tales of the unquiet dead emphasized duty, community, and vigilance. Rituals, laws, and protective charms reflected a deep understanding of human psychology, anticipating the ways in which fear and imagination shape behavior. The dead, in resisting rest, taught the living about order, care, and consequence. Their presence forced humans to confront mortality directly, embedding lessons into consciousness that continue to resonate, even in modern societies far removed from medieval superstition. And so, the restless live on, not in shadows of stone and soil alone, but in the imagination, ritual, and memory of humanity. They remind us that death is not merely an end, but a force that shapes the living, guides culture, and informs morality. The corpse, once feared for its unpredictability, becomes a bridge across time, connecting centuries of human reflection on fear, reverence, and mortality. In the silence that follows, we hear the echo of their presence. A legacy of vigilance, of story, and of the enduring human confrontation with the inevitability of death. In the end, the restless teach us that to live fully is to recognize mortality, to honor memory, and to walk in awareness that the dead, though silent, will always shape the living world. Their legacy endures, not as horror alone, but as wisdom, caution, and the hauntingly beautiful reminder of life's fragility.